Sometimes you're not worried about anything, and still your mind keeps returning to the exact same point. It isn't an important thought. It isn't urgent, and yet it comes back. You're doing something simple, replying to a message, organizing a routine task, and you notice that the same idea has already passed through your mind several times without adding anything new. There's no real problem there. It's just a quiet review of something that has already been thought through. This movement is usually too subtle to interrupt. The mind goes back to a phrase said hours earlier, replays a small fragment of a conversation, mentally adjusts a response that will never be sent. Nothing requires action. Still, the cycle continues. What's curious is that this repetition rarely shows up as immediate discomfort. It appears instead as a sense of continuation, as if something were still in progress, even when there is nothing left to resolve. During the day, this often goes unnoticed. External life provides enough direction. You respond to what needs to be answered, do what needs to be done, keep pace with incoming demands. The recurring thought stays active in the background, but all it takes is a brief gap, a moment of silence between tasks, an instant when nothing requires immediate attention, and the same content returns. Not urgently, not forcefully, it simply returns. The mind revisits a minor detail, adjusts a phrase that has already lost relevance, simulates a scenario that will probably never happen. Nothing feels serious, and yet, nothing actually closes. This is where the cycle begins to reveal something about itself. There is no clear beginning, no visible end. The thought doesn't advance enough to produce a conclusion, but it also doesn't disappear. It simply remains available. It's common to interpret this as careful attention or internal organization, as if the mind were just being thorough. But there is a subtle difference between tracking something that still matters and keeping something active that no longer requires your presence. That difference rarely announces itself. It appears only as repetition. You notice that you're mentally revisiting something you already understood, returning to the same point, rearranging the same words, considering variations that lead to no new decision. The feeling is not one of intense effort. It's one of persistence. The thought isn't heavy enough to stop, but it doesn't produce forward movement either. Meanwhile, other small ideas begin to connect to it. One detail leads to another. A memory pulls in a possibility opens yet another review. None of this forms a concrete problem. Still, the flow does not dissolve. This kind of cycle often remains invisible because it doesn't create open conflict. There's no obvious anxiety, no declared urgency. There is only a sequence of micro-revisions that keep the mind occupied without drawing enough attention to be questioned. Over time, this quiet continuity creates the impression that the mind is always on something, even when there is no defined task. The day moves forward. Your routine continues to function, and yet, this persistent activity never quite closes. Perhaps the strangest part is noticing that even when an idea seems finished, it returns with slight variations, as if it never actually ended. Not as a problem, more like an echo that never quite finds a final place to stop. And when that echo begins to repeat often enough, something deeper starts to hint at itself, something not yet fully clear, but seemingly capable of keeping the cycle in motion even in the absence of any real necessity. When this constant return stops feeling like an isolated occurrence and starts to be perceived as a pattern, the experience itself begins to shift. Not because the content of the thoughts becomes more intense, but because repetition takes on an almost automatic quality, as if the mind had learned a path and now continues to walk it even when there is no longer a reason to do so. The thought doesn't arise only when prompted by a concrete need. It reappears through familiarity, like a trail that has been used many times and therefore remains accessible, even without a clear intention to return to it. During the day, this easily blends with legitimate activity. You're reading something, and suddenly, a small internal review happens. It doesn't interrupt the reading. It simply occupies a parallel space. Minutes later, the same fragment returns with a minimal variation. Nothing has been resolved, yet the cycle remains available. This functioning rarely feels like a conscious choice. there is no active decision to revisit the same point. The mind simply maintains monitoring, as if checking whether something has changed, even when nothing new has been introduced. In this state, attention receives no clear signal of closure. When a task ends, the system that had been tracking that information doesn't automatically switch off. It remains in light readiness, prepared to pick up any detail that still appears open, even if that detail no longer has practical relevance. This mode of operation creates a subtle sense of internal continuity. One thought leads to another, not because there is progression, but because there was no ending. Small associations keep the flow active. A word triggers a memory. The memory suggests a possibility. The possibility reopens the original review. None of this requires visible effort. Still, something keeps running. It's common to interpret this constant tracking as care or responsibility, as if keeping everything under observation ensured that nothing important would be lost. But over time, the distinction between what truly needs monitoring and what could already be closed becomes less clear. The mind begins to treat almost everything as potentially relevant. This pattern does not appear all at once. It consolidates gradually, first as legitimate attention, then as quiet vigilance, until continuous monitoring becomes the default state. Even when the external environment is calm, internally something is still being followed. During pauses, this becomes more noticeable. There are no new demands, yet internal activity continues. An old detail is revisited. A past conversation reappears with slight adjustments. A hypothetical scenario receives a few more seconds of analysis. Nothing actually progresses, but nothing closes either. This functioning creates a constant secondary layer, a kind of silent observation that accompanies each experience without standing out enough to be recognized as a separate process. The mind appears to be just thinking, when in fact it is maintaining open loops out of habit. And the longer these loops remain without closure, the easier they become to reactivate. The path is already known. It takes almost no effort to walk it again. A small trigger, a word, a pause, a moment of silence, is enough for the same route to begin once more. At this point, something starts to hint more clearly. Perhaps it isn't the specific content that keeps the mind occupied, but the mechanism that prevents closure. This is not yet a conclusion. It is only the recognition that a process is in motion, one that does not depend on urgency or on any real problem in order to remain active. And if that mechanism continues operating even when nothing new needs to be resolved, then the question shifts from what is being thought to how that thought keeps returning without ever reaching a recognizable end. The accumulated effect of this functioning rarely appears as anything dramatic. It does not manifest as sudden exhaustion or as a visible drop in performance. On the contrary, life continues to operate with apparent normality. Tasks are completed, conversations happen, decisions are made, and still, there is a diffuse sense of wear that cannot be traced back to a specific event. This fatigue does not come from concentrated effort on a single point. It forms through continuity, through the sum of small cycles that remain active in the background as the day moves forward. Each mental return that never closes consumes a tiny fraction of energy. In isolation, it seems irrelevant. Repeated across hours, days, weeks, it begins to carry weight. Curiously, on busier days, this fatigue tends to be less noticeable. When attention is directed toward a clear sequence of demands, there is a beginning, middle, and end. Even if the effort is greater, there is closure. Energy is used and then released. The system understands that line of processing has finished. In lighter periods, when no dominant focus exists, open cycles find more room to reactivate. The mind fills the gaps with automatic reviews. There is not enough external urgency to close the internal monitoring. The result is a continuous dispersion that appears harmless but keeps consumption active. At this point, a distinction begins to emerge, even if only faintly. The problem is not thinking. The problem is the loop without closure. Thinking with direction organizes. It allows progression. It leads to some form of conclusion, even if provisional. The loop, by contrast, preserves movement without displacement. It maintains activity without delivering resolution. The mind works, but does not finish. This kind of functioning creates a specific sensation, always being almost done with something that never actually ends. A review that produces no new information, An analysis that does not alter a decision already made, a return that adds no clarity. Over time, this continuity without closure reduces the internal margin available. Small decisions begin to require more effort than before. Clarity takes slightly longer to emerge. Attention is easily captured by irrelevant details, not because they are important, but because there are already open pathways that facilitate the return. None of this prevents you from functioning, but it changes the quality of that functioning. The mind remains occupied even when there is no clear objective. And this constant occupation creates a sense of weight that does not correspond to the actual volume of tasks performed. What is hardest to notice is that this wear is not tied to the content of thoughts. It does not depend on whether they are positive or negative, complex or simple. The cost lies in the continuity of processing without a recognized point of closure. When a cycle does not close, it remains available, and what remains available tends to be reactivated. This logic gradually reshapes the internal experience. What began as occasional monitoring becomes the default state. The mind grows accustomed to operating in continuous review mode, even in the absence of novelty. As this pattern consolidates, the sense of fatigue stops being interpreted as situational. It begins to feel like a natural part of everyday functioning. And yet, a shift in perspective becomes possible, not as an immediate solution, but as a change in framing, when it is recognized that energy is not being drained by an excess of problems, but by the persistence of processes that never received a clear ending. That recognition does not immediately change the mind's pace. The cycles do not disappear simply because they have been named. What changes first is how they are perceived. When continuity is seen as continuity rather than necessity, something reorganizes at the level of interpretation. What once felt like a silent obligation to review, track, keep everything under observation begins to lose its status as an indispensable function. Not because it has been forcibly interrupted, but because it is no longer confused with something that must continue at all costs. A mind that feels trapped in its own loops is not necessarily dealing with more intense thoughts than usual. More often, it is dealing with thoughts that never received a recognized point of closure, ideas that remain available, lines of processing that were never explicitly concluded. This detail subtly alters the frame. It is not about eliminating thought, nor about reducing mental activity. It is about noticing that part of the weight came from the assumption that every return required fresh analysis. As that assumption weakens, the internal movement may still continue, but it no longer carries the same demand for full engagement. The mind remains active, but not necessarily committed to every microcycle that appears. This shift is not a technique. It does not depend on deliberate effort. It happens when the logic of the process becomes visible enough that it is no longer mistaken for urgency. What was once experienced as, "I need to keep thinking about this," may begin, sometimes only for a moment, to be recognized as, "This is still open, but it doesn't require action right now." The difference is subtle on the surface, but it changes the load associated with the process. Energy is no longer spent trying to finalize what cannot be finalized in that moment. The loop may return, but its return no longer automatically carries the same weight of importance. Over time, this shift in relationship with one's own internal processing changes the texture of the mental experience. Not because everything becomes quiet or orderly, but because activity is no longer interpreted as a sequence of implicit demands. The mind continues to generate associations, reviews, small simulations that does not disappear. What can change is the degree of identification with each of these passages. When a cycle is seen as a cycle, rather than as unfinished work, it tends to lose part of the force that kept it active. Not because it was forcibly stopped, but because it no longer receives additional energy. This kind of clarity does not resolve the system all at once. It does not close every pending process. It does not prevent new loops from forming. It simply creates a space in which continuity can be observed without being automatically followed. And within that space, something curious begins to happen. The mind that once felt like a room without an exit starts to reveal small variations of movement that do not depend on direct control. Not every thought requires tracking. Not every review needs to be completed. Some processes simply lose relevance once they are no longer treated as urgent. This is not a sudden change. It is a gradual adjustment in how one inhabits the flow of thought. The system continues operating, but with less pressure to finalize everything immediately. Perhaps this is why the sensation of being stuck in a thought does not disappear all at once, but can begin to feel less rigid when the loop is no longer interpreted as a constant obligation. The mind does not need to stop for the quality of experience to shift. Sometimes it is enough for the movement to stop being mistaken for a continuous demand for resolution. And as that distinction becomes clearer, even if only intermittently, the very idea of thinking too much begins to lose some of its weight, opening space to observe not only what is being thought, but how certain cycles remain active even when they no longer ask for direct participation.